January 28th, 1986. It was a Tuesday. In classrooms all across the United States, from the snowy streets of New Hampshire to the sunny suburbs of California, lessons stopped, math books were closed, history tests were put away. Millions of children sat on the floor, their legs crossed, their eyes glued to the glow of heavy television sets rolled in on metal carts. They were watching not a cartoon, not a movie, but a miracle. They were watching a teacher go to work. Her name was Krista McAuliffe. She was one of them. She wasn't a soldier with a chest full of medals. She wasn't a test pilot with a buzz cut and 1,000 hours in a fighter jet. She was a high school social studies teacher. She was a mother. She was the woman next door who graded papers late at night and shopped for groceries on weekends. And she was about to ride a pillar of fire into the heavens. The mood in America was electric. It was a celebration of the dream. It was proof that the future belonged to everyone. The Space Shuttle sat on Launch Pad 39B in Florida, gleaming white against a piercing blue sky. It looked perfect. It looked invincible. The countdown ticked toward zero. The engines roared with a sound that shook the earth for miles. The ship cleared the tower. The children cheered. They screamed with joy as the white smoke trail pierced the sky, carrying their teacher towards the stars. And then, 73 seconds later, the cheering stopped. The sky blossomed into a twisted, violent cloud of orange and white. The smoke trails split apart, wandering aimlessly like the legs of a dying spider. In the classrooms, the teachers gasped, hands flying to their mouths. The children pointed at the screens, confused. "Is that supposed to happen?" they asked. "Is that part of the show?" It wasn't part of the show. It was the end of an era. In 73 seconds, a nation went from the height of optimism to the crushing depth of despair. But the true horror of the Challenger disaster isn't just the explosion. It isn't just the fire. The true horror is that it never should have happened. The explosion didn't begin at T-0. It began hours earlier, in a heated boardroom where tired managers bullied terrified engineers. It began with a piece of rubber no bigger than a pencil. It began with a decision to ignore the laws of physics in favor of a schedule. 7 people were strapped into that ship. They were sitting on top of 4 million pounds of explosives, trusting that the people on the ground had done their math. They didn't know that the night before, the engineers had begged on their knees to stop the launch. They didn't know that their fate had already been sealed by a simple weather forecast. They were dead before the engines even lit. They just didn't know it yet. To understand the tragedy of Challenger, you must first understand the year 1986. It was the peak of the Reagan era, morning in America. The economy was booming. The Cold War was still freezing the map of Europe. But in the United States, there was a sense of technological invincibility. The Apollo era, the grainy black and white days of Neil Armstrong and the moon, felt like ancient history. That was the age of exploration. This was the age of exploitation. NASA had unveiled a new machine, the Space Transportation System, or STS. We knew it simply as the shuttle. It was unlike anything humanity had ever built. It was the world's first reusable spaceship. It launched like a rocket, operated like an orbital laboratory, and landed on a runway like a glider. It was a masterpiece of aerospace engineering, a machine of 2.5 million moving parts, all dancing in perfect synchronization. By January 1986, the shuttle fleet, Columbia, Challenger, Discovery, Atlantis, had flown 24 successful missions. Space travel had become routine. It had become the space truck. The shuttle carried spy satellites for the Pentagon. It carried scientific experiments for universities. It carried communication satellites that allowed the world to watch TV. The public had become bored. The news networks stopped broadcasting every launch live. It was as predictable as a bus leaving a terminal. The sentiment was clear. Another shuttle launch? Wake me up when they go to Mars. But this routine was a dangerous illusion. It lulled NASA into a false sense of security. It made them arrogant. The agency was under immense pressure. They had promised Congress that the shuttle would pay for itself. They promised a launch every 2 weeks. They promised that spaceflight would become as safe and cheap as commercial aviation, but the shuttle was not a commercial airliner. It was an experimental vehicle that pushed the very limits of material science. Every launch was a roll of the dice, and NASA had been rolling double sixes for 5 years. They began to believe that the dice were loaded in their favor. Behind the scenes, the schedule was crushing the workforce. Technicians were working double shifts. Spare parts were being cannibalized from one orbiter to fix another. The phrase "go fever" permeated the corridors of the Kennedy Space Center. Launch at all costs. Don't delay. The schedule is God. And in the middle of this high-pressure cooker, NASA decided to launch its most high-profile PR campaign in history. The mission was designated STSS-51L, but the world knew it as the Teacher in Space mission. In 1984, President Ronald Reagan announced that the first private citizen to fly on the shuttle would not be a politician or a journalist, but a teacher. The symbolism was powerful. Teachers build the future. Sending a teacher to space was a statement. Space is for everyone, even for the nice lady who teaches you history. More than 11,000 teachers applied. It was the ultimate golden ticket. The winner was Sharon Christa McAuliffe. She was perfect for the role. She wasn't a superwoman. She was relatable. She had curly brown hair, a wide, infectious smile, and a laugh that could fill a room. When she was selected, she became an instant celebrity. She appeared on The Tonight Show. She was on the covers of Time and Newsweek. She trained alongside the astronauts, but she never lost her civilian charm. She brought a stuffed frog toy for the flight. She planned to teach 2 lessons from orbit, one about how space works and one about why we explore. She was the face of the mission, but she wasn't alone. The crew of Challenger was a diverse cross-section of America, arguably the most representative crew NASA had ever assembled. There was Francis "Dick" Scobie, the commander, a gentle, soft-spoken man who had started as a mechanic in the Air Force before becoming a pilot. He was the father figure of the crew, known for his calm demeanor and his love for carpentry. There was Michael Smith, the pilot, a Navy veteran who had flown combat missions in Vietnam. This was his rookie flight. On the morning of the launch, he was heard joking about the cold, eager to finally earn his astronaut wings. There was Ellison Onizuka, the first Asian American in space, a jovial, beloved figure in the astronaut corps who loved to eat and tell jokes. He was the heart of the team. There was Judith Resnick, an electrical engineer with a PhD, intense, brilliant, and focused. She had already flown on the maiden voyage of discovery. She was recognizable by her flowing dark hair, which famously floated around her head in zero gravity. There was Ronald McNair, a physicist and a virtuoso saxophonist. He was a black belt in karate and a man of deep faith. He had planned to record the first saxophone solo in space for the musician Jean-Michel Jarre. And there was Gregory Jarvis, a payload specialist from Hughes Aircraft. He was an engineer's engineer. He had been bumped from 2 previous flights to make room for politicians. This was finally his turn. They were the perfect crew. They were the best of us. By January 1986, they were at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida, ready to make history. But there was a ghost haunting the launch pad, and the ghost's name was weather. Florida is known for sunshine, oranges, and humidity, but in late January 1986, a freak Arctic cold front descended from the north. It swept across the United States, freezing crops and bursting pipes as far south as Miami. By the week of the launch, the temperatures at Cape Canaveral were dropping to record lows. The launch had already been delayed several times, first by weather, then by a mechanical glitch with a hatch handle that refused to lock. NASA was frustrated. The media was mocking them. The mission impossible, some headlines joked. The flawless fiasco. NASA had a tight schedule to keep. They needed to launch Challenger so they could prepare the pad for the next mission, which was carrying a probe to observe Halley's Comet. Halley's Comet only comes around once every 76 years. If they missed the window, it would be a PR disaster of epic proportions. The pressure to go was immense. On the afternoon of January 27th, the day before the launch, the weather forecast was grim. The prediction was for temperatures to drop to 18 degrees Fahrenheit or -8 degrees Celsius overnight. This was unheard of for a Florida launch. Most of the NASA managers were worried about the water pipes on the launch tower freezing. They were worried about huge chunks of ice falling on the fragile heat tiles of the shuttle. But 2,000 miles away, in the snowy wasteland of Utah, a group of engineers was worried about something else. Something much smaller and much more deadly. The space shuttle doesn't fly alone. To get off the ground, it needs 2 massive white rockets strapped to its sides. These are the solid rocket boosters, or SRBs. They are the most powerful solid fuel rockets ever built. Once they are lit, they cannot be turned off. They burn until the fuel is gone. These boosters are huge, 150 feet tall. You cannot build them in one piece and ship them across the country. So they are built in segments. 4 steel cylinders that are stacked on top of each other like Lego blocks. The place where 2 segments meet is called a field joint. This joint is the weak point. When the rocket ignites, the pressure inside is immense. It wants to push the metal apart. It wants to escape. To seal these joints, the engineers used rubber O-rings. Imagine a giant rubber band 12 feet in diameter and half an inch thick. There were 2 of them in each joint, a primary and a secondary. Their job was to expand. When the rocket fired, the heat and pressure would push the rubber into the gap, sealing it tight in milliseconds. It was a simple, elegant design. But rubber has a weak. It obeys the laws of thermodynamics. Think about a rubber ball. If it is warm, it bounces. It is flexible. It is alive. But if you put a rubber ball in the freezer for a few hours, it becomes hard. It becomes brittle. If you throw it, it doesn't bounce. It might even crack. The engineers at Morton Thiokol, the company that built the boosters, knew this. They had data. They knew that below 53 degrees Fahrenheit, the O-rings lost their elasticity. They moved slower. They sealed slower. And the forecast for launch morning was 18 degrees. That is 35 degrees colder than the lowest temperature they had ever tested. It was uncharted territory. The night of January 27, 1986, the eve of the disaster, a teleconference was set up. It would become the most infamous meeting in the. On one end of the line were the NASA managers at Kennedy Space Center and Marshall Space Flight Center. They were tired. They were angry about the delays. They wanted to launch. On the other end in Utah were the engineers at Morton Thiokol. Among them were Roger Boisoli and Bob Ebeling. These 2 men are the tragic heroes of this story. They are the Cassandras who saw the future but could not stop it. Roger Boisoli had been studying the O-rings for months. On previous flights, he had seen soot blowing past the primary rings. He knew the design was marginal even in warm weather. When he saw the forecast for 18 degrees, he panicked. He told his colleagues, "It's going to fail. If the O-rings stay cold, they won't seal. The hot gas will blow past them. It will act like a blowtorch. It will cut through the steel like butter." The teleconference began. The Tyocon engineers presented their data. They showed charts. They showed photos of soot from previous missions. Their recommendation was clear and absolute. Do not launch. They stated that the temperature was way outside their database. They could not guarantee safety. NASA was stunned. They were used to contractors saying yes. They were not used to no. George Hardy, a high-ranking NASA manager, famously said, "I am appalled. I am appalled by your recommendation." Another manager, Lawrence Malloy, dropped the hammer. He asked, "My God, Thiokol, when do you want me to launch? Next April?" The intimidation was palpable. NASA was the customer. Thiokol was the contractor. The contract was up for renewal soon. The customer was angry. The Thiokol management asked for a 5-minute recess to discuss the matter offline. They muted the phone. Inside the room in Utah, the atmosphere became toxic. It was a battle between engineering ethics and corporate survival. Boisjoli and Ebeling fought for their lives, and for the lives of the crew. They slammed charts on the table. Boisjoli grabbed a photo of a damaged ring and shouted, "Look at this. We are going to kill them." He pleaded with his managers to look at the data, to listen to the physics. But the 4 senior executives of Thiokol weren't looking at the photos. They were looking at the silence from NASA on the other end of the line. They were afraid of losing the contract. Jerry Mason, the senior vice president, turned to his vice president of engineering, Bob Lund. Lund had been siding with the engineers. He knew it was unsafe. Mason looked him in the eye and said the sentence that would doom 7 people. A sentence that is now taught in every engineering ethics class in the world. Take off your engineering hat and put on your management hat. It was a demand to ignore physics and embrace politics. It was a demand to stop thinking about safety and start thinking about the schedule. Lund hesitated. He looked at the engineers. He looked at the table. Then he agreed. They overruled Boisjoli and Ebeling. They turned the phone back on. "We have reassessed," they told NASA. "The data is inconclusive. We recommend launch." NASA didn't ask, "Why did you change your mind?" They didn't ask for the new data. They just said, "Okay." The meeting ended. In the room in Utah, Roger Boisjoli sat in his chair, defeated. He felt sick. Bob Ebeling drove home to his wife. He was crying. He told her, "It's going to blow up." He couldn't sleep. He paced the floor all night. He prayed for the temperature to rise, but the thermometer kept dropping. January 28th, 1986. Launch day. The sun rose over Cape Canaveral. It was a dazzling, bright morning. The sky was a deep, saturated blue, but it was freezing. The launch pad looked like something out of a fairy tale or a horror movie. Because of the freezing pipes, the safety crews had turned on the water taps to keep the lines flowing. The water had sprayed everywhere and frozen. The massive launch tower was covered in icicles. Some were 2 feet long, hanging like daggers. It looked like an ice. The ice team was sent out to inspect. They were shocked. They measured the temperature on the solid rocket boosters. On the shadowed side, the right-hand booster, the temperature was only 8 degrees Fahrenheit. The steel was essentially a deep freezer. Inside the joints, the grease had turned to paste. The O-rings were hard as rocks. They were sitting in their grooves, frozen in place, utterly unable to expand, but the countdown continued. The crew was woken up. They had their traditional breakfast of steak and eggs. They were in high spirits. Krista McAuliffe was beaming. She was carrying her son's stuffed frog. Dick Scobie was calm. They suited up in their blue flight suits, not the orange pressure suits you see today. Those were added later, paid for by the blood of this crew. In 1986, they wore simple blue coveralls and motorcycle-style helmets. They had no parachutes. They had no escape system. The shuttle was considered operational. You don't wear a parachute on a Boeing 747, do you? They took the elevator up the tower. They walked past the icicles. They joked about the cold. "Feels like Antarctica," one of them said over the intercom. They strapped in. Scobie in the commander's seat, front left, Smith in the pilot, Resnick and Onizuka behind them on the flight deck. McAuliffe, Jarvis, and McNair were downstairs in the mid-deck. It was dark down there, no windows. They were essentially cargo. Mission Control went through the checklist. Booster hydraulic power unit, go. Cabin pressure, go. Rockwell, the company that built the orbiter, warned NASA about the ice falling off the tower and hitting the tiles. "We cannot guarantee it's safe," they said. NASA manager Arnie Aldrich decided to proceed anyway. "The ice will fall vertically, not hit the orbiter," he reasoned. Risk after risk was accepted. Warning after warning was ignored. The go fever had won. The families of the crew were in the grandstands. Krista's parents, her husband, Steve, her 2 children, Scott and Caroline. They were wrapped in coats and blankets, shivering in the cold wind, waiting to see Mummy go to space. In the VIP stands, the engineers from Tirecoal refused to watch. Boisjoli stayed in his office. He couldn't bear to look at the screen. He was waiting for the phone to ring with news of an explosion on the pad. T-minus 10 seconds. Go for main engine start. Sparks fly under the shuttle. The 3 main liquid engines roar to life. The shuttle rocks forward, straining against the bolts. The vibration shakes the frost off the external tank. T-minus 0. The solid rocket boosters ignite. At that exact millisecond, destiny was sealed. As the booster ignited, the pressure wave hit the bottom field joint of the right SRB. The joint rotated under the immense force. The gap opened. The O-rings, frozen solid, were too slow. They didn't pop into the gap. For a fraction of a second, hot gas, 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit, shot past the seals. It blew a puff of black smoke. You can see it in the footage. A distinct puff of black smoke puffing out from the side of the booster. It was the O-ring vaporizing. But then, a miracle, or a curse, happened. The solid fuel contained aluminum oxide. As it burned, it turned into slag. The slag got caught in the hot. It plugged the leak. For a moment, the ship was saved. The scab held the pressure. Challenger lifted off the pad, riding a pillar of fire into the clear blue sky. The crowd cheered. The children screamed with joy. Liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower. Roger Boisjoli, sitting in his office in Utah, heard that the shuttle had cleared the tower. He breathed a sigh of relief. He thought he was wrong. He thought they had made it. He didn't know about the wind shear waiting for them at 30,000 feet. He didn't know that the scab was fragile. He didn't know that the countdown to silence had already begun. The Space Shuttle Challenger is no longer a machine sitting on the ground. It is a projectile. It is a man-made meteor rising on a column of fire that is brighter than the sun. To the thousands of spectators freezing in the bleachers 3 miles away, it is a vision of perfection. The roar reaches them a few seconds after the light, a crackling, popping thunder that resonates in the chest cavity. It is the sound of pure power. It is the sound of American engineering conquering gravity. But inside the right-hand solid rocket booster, a war is being fought. A microscopic war between heat and aluminum. The O-rings, the rubber seals designed to keep the burning gas inside, have failed. They were frozen. They were too slow. At the moment of ignition, a jet of superheated gas, 5,000 degrees hot, shot past them. It blew a gap in the joint. By all laws of probability, the shuttle should have exploded right there on the launch pad. It should have been a catastrophe, a T-0, but fate offered a cruel reprieve. As the solid fuel burned, it produced aluminum oxide, a byproduct that turns into a thick, glassy slag. In the milliseconds following the leak, the slag was pushed into the gap. It hardened. It formed a temporary plug, a scab. So, as Challenger clears the tower, it is flying on borrowed time. It is flying with a hole in its side, sealed only by a fragile crust of burnt aluminum. If the ride is smooth, the scab might hold. If the forces are gentle, the crew might make it to orbit. But the atmosphere has one last weapon to use against them. T+7 seconds, the shuttle performs the roll program. It is a majestic maneuver. The massive vehicle rolls onto its back, pointing its belly toward the sky and its tail toward the ocean. This is done to alleviate stress on the wings and to align the antennas with the ground. Inside the cockpit, the view changes. Commander Dick Scobie and pilot Mike Smith are now hanging upside down in their straps, looking down at the blue Atlantic Ocean retreating beneath them. "Roll program," Smith reports. His voice is calm, professional. "Roger, roll," answers Mission Control in Houston. To the crew, everything feels normal. The vibration of the solid rockets is rough, like driving a sports car over a cobblestone street. But it is within limits. They have no warning lights, no alarms. The leak is happening behind them, invisible to their sense. They are happy. They are flying. T+20 seconds. The shuttle accelerates through the sound barrier. The sky turns from a light blue to a deep, dark indigo. The main engines are throttled down to 65% power to prevent the ship from tearing itself apart as it passes through the thickest part of the atmosphere. This period is called Max Q, maximum dynamic pressure. It is the moment when the air resistance pushing against the nose of the ship is at its absolute peak. The physical stress on the airframe is immense, and this is where the luck runs out. On this specific morning, the jet stream was acting strangely. High above Florida, at about 30,000 feet, there were violent wind shears, invisible rivers of air moving at hurricane speeds. As Challenger punches through this layer, it is battered. The telemetry shows the ship shuddering. The flight control computers fight to keep it on course, firing the nozzles of the main engines frantically to compensate for the wind. It is the worst wind shear ever recorded during a shuttle launch. The vibration is violent, and it is too much for the fragile scab of aluminum slag inside the right booster. T+58 seconds. The shuttle is passing through Max Q. The wind hammers the side of the booster. The vibration shakes the joint. The slag shatters. The plug is gone. The path for the hot gas is open again. Inside the booster, the pressure is 900 pounds per square inch. The gas rushes toward the hole with the force of a bomb. It burns through the putty. It burns through the steel casing. A tongue of fire, bright and focused, erupts from the side of the rocket. It looks like a blowtorch. This time, there is no stopping it. The flame is directional. It is pointing inward, toward the massive orange external tank that holds the liquid hydrogen and oxygen for the main engines. It acts exactly like a welding torch. It begins to cut. T+60 seconds. The flame grows. It is now a plume of fire 40 feet. It is licking the side of the external tank. It is attacking the strut, the metal brace that holds the booster to the shuttle. From the ground, the cameras track the ship. The image is blurry because of the distance, but if you look closely at the footage, you can see it. A small, flickering flicker of light on the side of the rocket. A localized fire in the wrong place. But nobody in Mission Control sees it. They are looking at their computer screens, at the numbers, and the numbers look normal. The pressure inside the booster is dropping slightly, but the computer interprets this as normal fuel burn. The tragedy is invisible to the data. T+68 seconds. The Capcom, capsule communicator in Houston, Richard Covey, receives a message from the flight dynamics officer. The shuttle has passed through the worst of the wind. The engines can be throttled back. Covey presses his button. Challenger, go at throttle up. This command, go at throttle up, is the last instruction the crew will ever hear. It is a permission to unleash the full power of the engines. It is a permission to accelerate into history. Commander Dick Scobie responds immediately. Roger, go at throttle up. These are the last words recorded from the Challenger. Acknowledgement, compliance, professionalism. T plus 72 seconds. The flame burns through the lower strut, holding the right booster. The strut snaps. The bottom of the booster, now free, swings outward. The top of the booster pivots inward. It crashes into the top of the external tank. It punches a hole in the liquid oxygen tank. At the same time, the bottom of the tank, weakened by the fire, fails. The liquid hydrogen rushes out. You have to understand the physics of what happens next. It is not an explosion in the traditional sense. It is not a bomb going off. It is a collision of elements. Thousands of gallons of liquid hydrogen, the fuel, mix with thousands of gallons of liquid oxygen, the oxidizer. They create a massive, expanding cloud of vapor. At this exact moment, the shuttle is traveling at Mach 1.92, almost twice the speed of sound. It is flying at an angle of attack that requires precise aerodynamics. When the tank disintegrates, the aerodynamics are destroyed. The shuttle is pushed sideways into the supersonic airstream. Imagine driving a car at 1,000 miles per hour and suddenly turning the steering wheel 90 degrees. The car doesn't explode, it disintegrates. It is torn apart by the wind. T plus 73 seconds. The structural breakup. The external tank collapses. The orbiter, the white plane carrying the crew, is subjected to 20 Gs of aerodynamic force. It snaps. The wings are ripped off. The cargo bay doors are torn open. The tail is shredded. The fuel ignites in a massive, blooming fireball of orange and white. It happens in a fraction of a second. One moment, there is a spaceship. The next moment, there is a cloud. To the naked eye on the ground, it looks like a bomb went off. A massive fireball engulfs the sky. The two solid rocket boosters, now free from the ship, fly out of the fireball. They form the iconic Y shape in the sky. They continue to fly, wild and uncontrolled, spiraling like fireworks, leaving twisting trails of smoke. Between them, the debris of the Challenger falls. But down on the ground, the reaction is not immediate. The speed of light is faster than the speed of sound. The spectators see the cloud before they hear the sound. In the classrooms, the children are confused. The teachers are smiling, then frowning. Is that the booster separation? Someone asks. It looks like a firework. At the launch site, the families of the crew are watching. Krista McAuliffe's parents shield their eyes from the sun. Her mother looks anxious. Her sister screams, "The booster," thinking it's a normal stage separation. But the NASA PAO, Public Affairs Officer, Steve Nesbitt, is silent. He is looking at his monitor. He sees the data vanish. In mission control, the room goes deadly quiet. The telemetry screens freeze. The lines of data that represent the heartbeat of the ship simply stop. There is a static letter S on the screens, meaning the signal is lost. The flight director, Jay Green, stands at his console. He stares at the large screen at the front of the room. He sees the cloud. He knows. He taps his pencil on the desk, once, twice. It is a nervous tick, a realization of horror. He presses his loop button. "Fido trajectory," he asks, hoping for a miracle. The flight dynamics officer responds, his voice shaking. RSO reports vehicle exploded. RSO is the range safety officer, the man with the button to destroy the rockets if they go off course. He hasn't put the ship destroyed itself. And then, the voice of Steve Nesbitt comes over the public broadcast. It is a voice devoid of emotion, a voice trying to process the impossible. Flight controllers here looking very carefully at the situation. Pause. Obviously, a major malfunction. Major malfunction. It is the understatement of the century. It is the phrase that will define the disaster. In the VIP stands, the cheers have died. A low moan moves through the crowd. It is the sound of thousands of people realizing simultaneously that they have just watched 7 people die. Krista McAuliffe's parents are huddled together. Her mother is weeping. Her father is staring blankly at the sky. A NASA official climbs into the stands and whispers to them. They are led away. The cameras zoom in on the cloud. It is expanding, drifting in the wind. Debris is falling out of it. Large chunks of metal, the wings, the engines. They glitter in the sun as they tumble. It takes a long time for things to befall. Lasts for more than 2 minutes. For 2 minutes, the debris rains down into the Atlantic Ocean. But the most terrifying part of this story is not the explosion. It is what survived the explosion. The crew cabin. The nose section of the shuttle, the reinforced cockpit where the 7 astronauts were sitting, did not explode. It was built to be the strongest part of the ship. When the shuttle broke apart, the nose section was ripped clean off. It remained intact. It was thrown clear of the fireball. It continued to fly upward, carried by its own momentum. It reached a peak altitude of 65,000 feet, and then it began to fall. This is the nightmare scenario that NASA didn't want to talk about for years. The crew was not blown up. They were not incinerated. They were sitting in their seats, in a detached cabin, falling through the blue sky. The cabin was pressurized. It had air. It had no power, no lights, no connectivity, but it was intact. For 2 minutes and 45 seconds, the cabin fell, it tumbled, it spun, and inside that cabin, the 7 astronauts were still there. We know they were alive. How do we know? Because when the wreckage was recovered from the ocean floor months later, investigators found the personal egress air packs, PEs, the emergency oxygen tanks behind the seats. 3 of them had been activated. One belonged to pilot Mike Smith, but the switch to activate the tank is on the back of the seat. Smith could. Someone had to unstrap, reach over, and turn it on for him. Most likely it was Ellison Onizuka or Judy Resnick. This means that in the seconds after the explosion, they were alive. They were trying to save each other. They were falling. The roar of the explosion was gone. The roar of the engines was gone. There was only the sound of the wind rushing past the windows, the sound of their own breathing in the masks. They were in free. They reached terminal velocity, 200 miles per hour. They fell for nearly 3 minutes. Imagine that. 3 minutes. Enough time to think. Enough time to realize. Enough time to say goodbye. Did they pray? Did they hold hands? Did they hope that the parachutes they didn't have would somehow... Or did they look out the window and see the blue ocean rushing up to meet them? At mission control, they were helpless. They watched the radar track the falling debris. "We have no downlink," the flight director said. They kept the communication channels open, just in case. Challenger, Houston. Challenger, Houston. Silence. Only the crackle of... At T+3 minutes and 58 seconds, the crew cabin hit the surface of the Atlantic Ocean. It hit the water at 207 miles per hour. The force of the impact was 200 Gs. The structure was crushed instantly. If they were conscious during the fall, the end came at that moment of impact. It was instantaneous. It was the mercy of physics. Back on land, the smoke trails hung in the sky like a scar. The Y shape of the boosters began to twist in the wind, forming a shape that some said looked like a single tear. In the classrooms, the TVs were turned off. The teachers were crying. They tried to explain to the children what death was. The shuttle broke, they said. The teacher is gone. The innocence of the space age was over. The space truck was broken. The sky, which had always been a place of dreams, had suddenly become a graveyard. And in Utah, Bob Ebeling sat in his office, his head in his hands. He had watched it happen. He whispered to the empty room, I told them. But nobody was listening then. Now the whole world was listening, and the silence was deafening. January 28, 1986, 11:40 a.m. The sky above Florida is finally clear. The twisted white smoke trails, which had hung in the air like a scar for nearly an hour, are beginning to dissipate in the wind. But down below, on the surface of the Atlantic Ocean, the nightmare is just beginning. From the coastline, the explosion looked like a silent firework, a tragedy viewed from a safe distance. But out at sea, 18 miles off the coast, it sounded like an artillery barrage. NASA's recovery ships, the Liberty Star and the Freedom Star, were already in the water. Their original mission was routine: wait for the solid rocket boosters to parachute down, tow them back to port, and refurbish them for the next flight. Instead, they found themselves sailing into a war zone. The debris from the Challenger didn't float down gently like confetti. It fell from the stratosphere. Huge chunks of twisted aluminum, steel engines weighing tons, and fragile ceramic tiles hit the ocean at terminal velocity. They struck the water with the force of bombs, sending geysers of spray 100 feet into the air. The ocean was boiling. The unburned solid propellant from the shattered boosters was reacting with the salt water. It created a toxic, bubbling chemical stew. Clouds of hydrochloric acid mist drifted over the waves. The air didn't smell like the ocean. It smelled of sulfur, burning rubber, and death. The recovery director, speaking over the encrypted radio channel, shouted a warning to all vessels. Stay back. Do not approach the impact zone. It is falling. It is still falling. For nearly 50 minutes, the rain of metal continued. Pieces of the cargo bay doors fluttered down like autumn leaves. Heavy pieces of the main engines plummeted like stones. The ocean swallowed them all. And somewhere in that chaotic rain, unnoticed by the cameras, falling faster than the rest, was a reinforced aluminum cylinder. The crew compartment. It hit the water intact. It didn't break apart on impact. It punched through the surface and It sank immediately. It didn't float. It vanished into the murky grey Atlantic, taking 7 souls with it to the bottom. Back on land, the television networks were running the replays. Again and again. The explosion. The Y shape. The grief on the faces of the parents. The world was comforting itself with a lie. It is a natural human defense mechanism. When we see something horrific, we rewrite the narrative to make it bearable. The news anchors, the politicians, and even the NASA officials began to repeat the same mantra. It was instant. They didn't feel a thing. They were gone before they knew it. It is a comforting thought. We want to believe that in a disaster of such magnitude, the end comes with the mercy of speed. We want to believe that the fireball consumed them, that they were turned to stardust in a millisecond. But the ocean holds secrets, and it would take 6 long, agonizing weeks for the ocean to give them up. And when it did, the truth would shatter the instant death narrative forever. The search for Challenger became the largest maritime salvage operation in history, surpassing even the search for the Titanic. The U.S. Navy, the Coast Guard, and NASA mobilized an armada, 6,000 personnel, 52 aircraft, a fleet of surface ships covering 480 square nautical miles of open ocean. They treated the Atlantic floor not as a seabed, but as a crime scene. They divided the ocean into a grid. Every square mile was ships towed side-scan sonar arrays, torpedo-like devices that pinged the bottom with sound waves, back and forth, mowing the lawn, day and night. The conditions were treacherous. The currents off the coast of Florida are strong. The visibility is poor. Sharks are common. But the psychological toll on the search crews was worse than the physical danger. Every time a sonar shadow appeared on the screens in the darkened control rooms of the ships, the conversation would stop. Target acquired, the operator would whisper, "Is that a wing? Is that a computer? Is that them?" For the first few weeks they found only scraps, a piece of a glove floating in the surf, a helmet washing up on a... These were tantalizing, heartbreaking clues. But the main wreckage, the heavy parts, remained elusive. The ocean is vast, and the Challenger had been reduced to millions of fragments. Then, on March 7, 1986, nearly 6 weeks after the disaster, a sonar sweep detected a large concentration of debris in roughly 100 feet of water. It didn't look like scattered metal, it looked like a pile. The Navy sent down the NR-1. This was a legendary vessel, a nuclear-powered research submarine capable of staying submerged for weeks, driving along the ocean floor on wheels. The NR-1 crept through the darkness, its powerful floodlights cut through the gloom, illuminating the silt and the sand. Through the grainy black and white video feed, the operators saw it. It was a tangled mass of wires, white, thermal blankets, and crushed aluminum. It looked like a crushed soda can. But then the camera panned. They saw blue, the distinctive bright blue fabric of the NASA flight suits. And then they saw the letters on a patch. SCOBY. The message went up to the surface. It was coded, top secret, to prevent the media from intercepting the radio traffic. The 7 have been found. They hadn't been vaporized. They hadn't been blown to pieces in the sky. They were all together. This discovery changed everything. If the cabin was there, if the bodies were there, then the explosion hadn't killed them. The fire hadn't touched them. NASA locked down the information instantly. They feared a media circus. They recovered the cabin in a secret operation. A crane lifted the dripping wreckage onto the deck of the USS Preserver. It was immediately covered with heavy tarps. Armed guards stood watch. They didn't want the world. They brought the wreckage to a secure, windowless hangar at Cape Canaveral, and the autopsy of the machine began. The investigation into the crew cabin was one of the most secretive and painful chapters in NASA's history. It was led by Dr. Joseph Kerwin, a former astronaut and a medical doctor. His job was to answer the question that the families were terrified to ask, and that NASA was terrified to answer: how long were they alive? Kerwin and his team looked at the wreckage, the nose section of the shuttle, the reinforced pressure vessel where the astronauts lived, had been severed cleanly from the rest of the fuselage. Crucially, there were no burn marks on the seats. There was no charring on the flight checklists. The plastic switches were not melted. This confirmed the first horror. The fireball was a visual spectacle, but it didn't touch the crew. The cabin flew through the flames too fast to be burned. Then they checked for explosive decompression. If the windows had blown out at 46,000 feet, the sudden drop in pressure would have been violent. It would have ripped the air out of their lungs. It would have caused instant unconsciousness. But the wreckage told a different story. The windows were intact until impact. The pressure hull was crushed by the water, not exploded by the air. This meant the cabin likely held its air pressure, at least for a while. Then they looked at the equipment. Behind each of the 4 seats on the flight deck was a device called a PEAP, Personal Egress Air Pack. It wasn't a parachute. It wasn't an ejection seat. It was simply a small yellow tank of breathable air connected to a hose and a mask. It was designed for use on the ground, in case there was smoke in the cockpit after landing. It provided about 6 minutes of air. The investigators recovered 4 PEAPs from the ocean floor. They belonged to the astronauts on the upper deck: Commander Scobie, Pilot Smith, Mission Specialist Resnick, and Mission Specialist Onizuka. They examined the valves. 3 of them had been activated. The switches were flipped to the on position. The air had been flowing. This was the smoking gun. The tanks didn't turn on by themselves. The force of the explosion didn't turn them on. The impact with the water didn't turn them on. A human hand, a conscious, deliberate human hand, had to reach back, grab the valve, turn it 90 degrees, and start the flow of air. But here is the detail that keeps you awake at night. The detail that proves heroism in the face of death. Mike Smith's pack was located on the back of his seat. He was strapped in with a 5-point harness. He was wearing a bulky helmet. He physically could not reach the switch behind his own head. Someone else had to turn it on for him. Most likely, it was Judy Resnick or Ellison Onizuka. They were sitting behind him. In the chaos, in the tumbling, spinning madness of the separation, one of them reached forward. "Here, Mike. Breathe." This simple act of kindness proves that in the seconds after the fireball, they were not just alive. They were conscious. They were thinking. They were trying to save each other. Using the wreckage, the radar data, and the state of the air packs, NASA was able to reconstruct the final timeline of the crew. It is a timeline that dismantles the myth of a painless end. The external tank explodes. The shuttle structure fails under aerodynamic load. The nose section tears away. At this moment, the G-forces are violent, estimated between 12 and 20 Gs. It feels like being hit by a freight train. It slams the astronauts into their seats. It is enough to possibly knock them out for a few seconds, but likely not enough to kill them or cause permanent brain damage. The cabin is thrown clear of the fire. It is traveling upward at Mach 1.5, faster than the speed of sound. The cabin continues to fly upward, carried by its massive momentum. It is a ballistic projectile. The roar of the main engines stops instantly. The violent shaking of the solid rockets stops. The silence returns. Imagine that silence. 1 second, you are riding a roaring rocket. The next, you are floating in a detached metal box in the middle of the sky. The lights on the dashboard go out. The intercom goes dead. "Houston? Houston." Only the hiss of static in the headsets. If they were conscious, and the air packs suggest they were, this is when the realization hit. They looked out the windows. They saw the fire below them. They saw the wings gone. They saw the trails of the boosters flying away erratically. They knew the cabin reaches the top of its arc, about 65,000 feet, 20 kilometers. For a brief moment it hangs there, zero gravity. Objects float. Dust floats. The sky outside is almost black. They are on the edge of space, but they will never reach it. Then gravity takes hold. The fall begins. The cabin begins to fall back to Earth. Without wings or a tail to stick, the spin is the critical factor. If the cabin spun fast enough, the centrifugal force would push the blood away from their brains, causing a redout or blackout. They would pass out painlessly. This was NASA's hope. This was the merciful theory. But the investigators found something that contradicted this. On the pilot's control panel, several electrical switches related to the hydraulic system and the power buses had been moved from their launch positions. Pilot Mike Smith had been flipping switches. Why? He was trying to restore power. He was trying to get the ship flying again. He didn't know the wings were gone. He didn't know the tail was gone. He was a test pilot. His instinct, trained over thousands of hours, was to fly the machine until the ground stopped him. If he was flipping switches, he was awake. And if he was awake, he wasn't spinning fast enough to pass out. The cabin accelerated. It pierced the clouds. The air rushed past the windows with a scream that grew louder and louder. They fell for 2 minutes and 45 seconds. Do you know how long that is? Stop reading, look at your watch, close your eyes, and count to 165. It is an eternity. It is enough time to say the Lord's Prayer. It is enough time to think about your children waiting on the ground. It is enough time to look at your crewmates and see the terror in their eyes. In the mid-deck, it was dark. Krista McAuliffe, Greg Jarvis, and Ron McNair were sitting in the windowless lockers. They couldn't see the sky. They could only feel the sickening sensation of the drop. Did they hold hands? We don't know. But the air packs tell us they were breathing. The gauges on the recovered tanks showed that about 75 to 90% of the air had been consumed. The investigators did the math. That amount of air matches the duration of the fall perfectly. They didn't just turn them on and pass out. They breathed the air all the way down. They were conscious, breathing and waiting for the end. T plus 3 minutes and 58 seconds. The end. The cabin hit the surface of the Atlantic Ocean at approximately 207 miles per hour, 333 kilometers per h. The force of the impact was calculated at over 200 Gs. To compare, a severe car crash is 30 Gs. A fighter pilot pulling up hard is 9 Gs. 200 Gs is not survivable. The human body turns to liquid. The aluminum structure collapsed instantly, crushing everything inside to a fraction of its size. If they were awake, if they were praying, if they were screaming, it ended in a millisecond. The lights went out forever. When the final medical report was written, Dr. Kerwin chose his words with extreme care. He was walking a fine line between scientific truth and mercy for the families. He wrote, "The cause of death of the Challenger astronauts cannot be positively determined." He cited impact with the water as the likely fatal event. But then he added the sentence that haunts history: "It is possible, but not certain, that consciousness was lost in the seconds following the breakup due to loss of cabin pressure." It was a polite, bureaucratic way of saying, "We hope they passed out, but we have evidence they didn't." The rumors of a secret tape persisted for decades. People claimed there was a recording of the crew talking on the way down. Some tabloids even printed fake transcripts with screaming and prayers. They are urban legends born of morbid curiosity. The cockpit voice recorder was recovered, but it stopped precisely at the moment of the explosion when the power was cut. Pilot Mike Smith's last words were, "Uh-oh." Just that, "Uh-oh." He saw the flash. He felt the jolt. After that, silence. The horror of the fall was unrecorded. There were no final words for history, only the hiss of oxygen masks, the roar of the wind, and the private thoughts of 7 people facing the inevitable. The recovery of the remains was a grim task. I will not describe it in graphic detail. The dignity of the crew deserves protection. But the logistics of it reveal the magnitude of the tragedy. The debris from the cabin was brought to shore in sealed containers. It was not taken to a morgue, but to a secure scientific facility. Identifying the remains took weeks. Finally, in April 1986, the families were notified, "We have them." Then came the question of the ship itself. What do you do with 100 tons of twisted metal that killed America's heroes? You can't put it in a museum. It's too painful. You can't sell it for scrap. It's too sacred. NASA made a decision. They took every piece of the Challenger debris, the wings, the cabin, the tires, the engines, and they drove them to an abandoned missile silo complex at Cape Canaveral. Launch Complex 31. It consists of 2 deep concrete silos, originally built for Minuteman missiles during the Cold War. They lowered the debris into the silos, piece by piece. Then they capped the silos with massive concrete lids weighing tons. They sealed them. There is no plaque. There is no sign. Just 2 concrete mounds in the Florida scrub, surrounded by a fence. The Challenger is still there today, buried in the dark, 50 feet underground, right next to the launch pads where rockets still fly. It is a tomb for a machine. But the truth about the O-rings, the weather, and the warnings could not be buried in a silo. While the bodies were being laid to rest, a storm was brewing in Washington. A commission was formed to investigate the disaster. It was called PEAPs, and on that commission was a man who didn't care about politics. He didn't care about NASA's image. He only cared about the truth. His name was Richard Feynman, a Nobel Prize-winning physicist with wild hair and a rebellious streak. He was about to walk into a press conference with a glass of ice water and a C-clamp, and he was about to tear NASA's excuses apart in front of the entire world. February 3rd, 1986. Washington, D.C. The mood in the Capitol was grim. The flags on every government building were flying at half-staff, flapping sluggishly in the cold winter wind. The wreckage of the Challenger was still being fished out of the Atlantic Ocean, piece by bloody piece. But in the corridors of power, the shock was turning into something else. Fear. NASA was not just a space agency. It was a symbol of American exceptionalism. It was the agency that beat the Soviets to the moon. It was the agency that could do no wrong. And now, 7 Americans were dead on live television, and nobody could explain why. President Ronald Reagan knew that NASA could not be trusted to investigate itself. The agency was too insular, too proud, and too defensive. If left alone, they would likely bury their mistakes in a mountain of technical jargon and classified reports. Reagan took action. He signed Executive Order 12546, creating the Presidential Commission on the Space Shuttle Challenger accident. It became known as the Rogers Commission. The list of members read like a who's who of American heroism. There was William Rogers, the chairman, a former Secretary of State, a polished diplomat who knew how to manage a crisis. There was Neil Armstrong, the first man on the moon, the ultimate icon of the space age, quiet, reserved, and universally respected. There was Chuck Yeager, the first man to break the sound barrier. There was Sally Ride, the first American woman in space who was still an active astronaut and arguably knew the shuttle better than anyone. It was a collection of titans. They were expected to conduct a dignified, orderly investigation. They were expected to produce a polite report that identified a technical glitch, recommended a fix, and allowed NASA to move on. But there was a wild card in the deck. A man who didn't fit in. A man who didn't care about dignity or politics. His name was Richard Feynman. Richard Feynman was a Nobel Prize-winning physicist from Caltech. He was a genius who had worked on the atomic bomb at Los Alamos during World War II. But he wasn't your typical scientist. He played bongo drums. He picked locks for fun. He frequented strip clubs to do mathematics on napkins. He hated suits, hierarchy, and bullshit. And he was dying. Feynman was battling a rare form of abdominal cancer. His kidneys were failing. He knew, with the clarity that only the dying possess, that this investigation would likely be his final contribution to the world. He didn't have time for NASA's polished PowerPoint presentations. He didn't have time to be polite. He wanted the answer. From the very first meeting, Feynman was a problem for Chairman Rogers. While the other commissioners went to formal dinners and shook hands with NASA administrators, Feynman went rogue. He refused to stay in the fancy hotel arranged for the commission. Instead, he hailed a taxi and drove straight to the NASA engineers' offices. He walked in unannounced, wearing a disheveled suit, looking like a lost tourist. He sat down with the guys in the trenches, the engineers who actually built the engines, not the managers who signed the checks. He asked simple, devastating questions. Does this leak? How often does this fail? Show me the data. He found a culture of fear. He found engineers who were screaming warnings that were being filtered out as they moved up the chain of command. He discovered that NASA managers had convinced themselves that the shuttle was as safe as a commercial airliner, claiming the risk of failure was 1 in 100,000. Feynman did the math on a napkin. If that were true, You could fly the shuttle every day for 274 years without an accident. The engineers, however, told him the real risk was closer to 1 in 100. NASA was playing Russian roulette, and they had convinced themselves the gun wasn't loaded.